are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Managing Culture to Mitigate Risk. I'm Emily Sandilands, the Content Marketing Manager over here at Denison Consulting, and before we begin today's session, I just want to give you a quick overview of the format we'll be using. We'll begin today's webinar by hearing from Levi Nieminen, Denison's Director of Research and Development, who will help us take a closer look at the culture-risk connection and discuss how organizations can diagnose risk. We will then hear from Dave Kirchoff, VP of Consulting Services over here at Denison Consulting, who will discuss how organizations can turn insights gained about risk into action. We'll spend the remainder of our time today, about 10 minutes, answering any questions from our audience. We'll do our very best to get through as many questions as possible in the time allotted today. So please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar widget to submit any questions you might have throughout the duration of today's session. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Levi, who will get us started. Levi?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time out with us. For those friends and colleagues on the East Coast in the States, even your lunch hour. So we really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you a little bit today about our perspective, some of the research, some of the consulting work that we've been developing and delivering here at Denison. I wanted to start today's session out with a question, a provocative question here about who really ultimately should care about risk in organizations, who does care about risk in organizations. Those are often not the same answer to those two questions. The bottom line takeaway for us with this, having done work in this space, is that it's really about all organizations at the end of the day, whether you're brave enough to summit K2 here and now you need to even add earthquakes to the list of risk factors involved in that one, down to high finance industry, private equity, Wall Street traders, where risk is very apparent. It's an everyday part of life in those settings. But it's also about organizational settings that often look and act in a much more mundane, setting of day-to-day organizational life. Who would have thought, over the past decade that checkout lines and point of sale in retail stores could be a setting in which data, privacy, personal information could be compromised in a way that we've seen that happen. Who would have thought, a company that really created the photography industry, the technology of that industry for years and years, decades and decades, would fall behind in the competition in that industry as we enter and are now, soundly into the new digital era. Who would have thought, even more devastating, who would have thought that a setting like a classroom could in some ways come to be defined from a risk perspective from, some of the horrific events that we've seen with violence unfolding and other episodes there, or that the most trusted, manufacturing companies could have a series of visible product defects that could compromise consumer safety. And so just a few examples there to really hammer home the point that every organization operates in an environment that involves a lot of risk. It's about how we choose or don't choose to look at those things and manage them that becomes very apparent and sets organizations apart from one another. The other thing that the images on the screen and these examples help to set in terms of context is really the idea that the lines between the internal and the external are blurry, or beyond that, maybe they're even non-existent in terms of who feels the consequences, good and bad, of how organizations manage their risks. And it's quite clear in these examples that the answer is we all do. Not just the executives, the employees of these organizations, but also the consumers of the goods, services, products that we use. One of the things that makes this space such an interesting and challenging space to work in certainly from a culture perspective, is that organizations must make a choice to spend time dealing and focusing in the uncertainties of the future. Underscore the uncertainty part of that. We're talking about probabilities. And it's very difficult to maintain a focus on probabilities over a series of days, weeks, months, years, perhaps, of non-events. So this is a space really, for the most part, marked by non-events. Obviously, when the event happens, we remember it. It's painful. It changes everything, perhaps, for the organization and the industry. But most of the time, it's about creating more of these non-events, scenarios where we've managed risk appropriately. So that's the best that we can hope for here, is that we create something where the end product, in terms of a risk outcome perspective, is nothing. And nothing is quite difficult. It's not a very visible outcome to aim for. It's not clear who created it and why it was created, and that's often how we figure out cause and effect in organizations, is we do something and then we observe the results of that. And here, again, we'll be observing nothing if we get it right. And it's also not a very motivating or compelling case for change or for improvement. But we know that the external world, the role of time, and the degradation of our systems means that we do need to sustain focus on this, and we do need to constantly look for new ways to improve and to change the way that organizations respond to risk. When you think about these different settings in organizations, it's quite clear that the shape and size of these risks really takes on 1,000,001 different possibilities. When you put those all down on paper or maybe a slide, and this is a fraction of things you can think about, it's really quite amazing to think about the broad range of circumstances and risks that all organizations are exposed to in their day-to-day practice. Some of those risks may be internal dilemmas that organizations face around systems, processes, people, the nature of the job being done. Some of those risks represent external forces, demands, and changes, things that happen in the market, the broader economies that we operate in, the regulatory environments, and changes with the consumer and what they want and need from us. So it's the constant response and the adaptation of the organization to these risks that becomes extremely important to the long-term success of any organization. The top 3 risks up there for you today are very unlikely to be the top 3 risks up there for you tomorrow, next month, next quarter, etc. Now, one of the things that's really interesting working with organizations and studying how they respond to risk is that you can think about that response along a couple of different continuums. And certainly there are more than 3 ways to think about this, but I'll quickly give you 3 that you can use to think about. The first we might characterize as the difference between explicit and implicit response to risk. Explicit is a conscious and intentional choice about how the organization will view, identify, and respond to risks, whereas implicit, organizations may not deal with risk out in the light of day, so to speak. They may have made implicit choices learned over time, concluding that their time would be better spent elsewhere, that some of the factors, or maybe most of the factors on this list, are out of their control, or perhaps that bad news discussions, because often that is a starting point for talking about risk, is sharing the bad news, that those things are not acceptable in the organization. And organizations really vary quite a bit in how they handle those. You can also think about the continuum of formal versus informal. Large corporations have gotten a lot better about professionalizing functions, systems, processes around how risk is handled, how risk is mitigated. A lot of other organizations manage mainly from an informal perspective still, which means more of an intuitive response to risk, maybe not a formalized or routine process for how risks are handled. but where that may also be effective. The formalized risk management, enterprise-wide risk management process may not be for every organization. And lastly, you can think about the difference between organizations that view and respond to risk as being mainly an individual issue. So we may think of bad apples, bad actors, maybe some good apples, good actors in there, but where it's mainly the outcome of individual behavior. And every individual may have a different viewpoint on risk, but that becomes the focus of how we organize. Other organizations take more of a collective focus, and the intent there is really to make what is known to an individual and the individual's role in risk something that's shared, that's visible, that's part of the fabric of the organization, and where the organization is viewed as a system, where the system as a whole is what ultimately contributes to risk and how it's managed. So long story short, organizations really differ with respect to what those risks are, and how the culture that they're able to create can really vary in their response that they provide to risk. So if we take the case of an organization that has the more explicit, formalized risk management functions, practices, processes, one reasonable question to ask here that we hope to address throughout the time we have with you is, where does culture fit in? Why should we care about the side of the equation that is about the quote-unquote intangibles, the stuff that's difficult to see? Lots of metaphors in the culture space. If you've done work in this space, you've seen the iceberg, at least a couple thousand times. But it reinforces the idea that, a big part of that iceberg is in the intangible, invisible side of how we organize. And that the outcome of those values, norms, mindsets, the habits that really guide how organizations behave and respond to risk really factor into the outcomes that the organization experiences. One of the fun things in this field over the last 10 years is that we've really seen the research advance quite a bit to show the connections between these cultural elements and performance outcomes in particular. And we know a lot more now about how the culture of an organization shapes the performance and can be a competitive advantage for the firm. And that one of the key ways that it does that is in how it aligns people around the execution of the strategy that the organization has laid out. So we know that culture is quite important to performance. On the risk side, we also know that culture has a lot to do with how the organization anticipates and responds to risk. And the literature around safety culture, risk culture, the interconnections between behavior, value, norms, and risk outcomes, again, has become quite a bit stronger in the last decade. And we now know with a lot sharper perspective the ways in which culture also influences risk. And the ones that we'll focus on today are not a comprehensive list. It's not all of the ways that culture interacts with risk, but it is a few key ways in which it impacts how the organization responds. And we'll focus on detection, dialogue, and planning as a few of those key ways where culture really means a lot to how the organization does this. I'm going to use, like I so often like to do, some images to kind of lay the landscape for each of these things, and just talk you through the perspective where these perspectives are quite teachable in organizations. So when we talk about shifting mindsets, these are some areas where you would really want to focus on shifting mindsets. And there are also areas where intervention is possible. And in the latter half of the talk, as Emily mentioned, Dave will walk us through one intervention in particular that really connects closely with planning. Detection. You think about the guy who's brave enough, maybe dumb enough, insert your own adjective here, that's jumping off the platform into the uncertain waters below, and how we come to a collective decision around whether or not that's a good thing to do or maybe a pretty dangerous thing to do. And one of the interesting things to think about with this is that it's a little bit like building the jigsaw puzzle, where each of us shows up with only one piece of the puzzle, and then the job is to put that together into something that is cohesive and makes sense, tells a story about the environment that we operate in and the risks that we face. So you think about this guy diving off the dock, and down below, hopefully that was preceded by a series of discussions from each of the people that are already in the water about what it was like when they came in, what it was like when they jumped off. But you can see that not everybody is the same size. So we've got the person that was 4'10", 120 pounds that jumped off. Now, they didn't hit the bottom. They didn't crash into a rock. They were okay. Doesn't mean that the guy who's 6'5", 220 is going to experience the same outcome, but it does give us some information. We've got different people looking into the water from different angles, different perspectives, all, again, looking at the same context, but only themselves as individuals carrying maybe 5 to 10% of the situational awareness that's needed to make this a cohesive whole that we can then respond to. So take this into the organizational setting, and it's really about the people in the organization and the people that are at the front lines and the people that are at the fringes who see and experience on a day-to-day basis the elements of the situation that we need to translate into good judgments and good action. So how do we help them do that? Well, there's detection, which has to do with looking at the situation and differentiating the signals from the noise to pass those on. But then from there, it's really often about a choice about what we speak up about or what we choose to, perhaps sweep under the rug in many cases. And when you look back at case studies, about organizations that have faced adverse risk events, one of the common threads in there is that someone somewhere at some point got information, detected something that they either chose or had the inability to speak up about. And so the information never got passed on. And we know a lot more now about how culture influences that and how organizations can work on that. The image on this one is an image of pilot Jacob van Zanten, the Dutch pilot of the KLM Boeing 747. That was one of the, certainly the most devastating. It had the most fatalities of any civil aviation incident over the years, in which the KLM flight crashed into a Pan Am flight, both of which were sitting on the same runway, 1977 in the Canary Islands. And it was a confluence of events that led to it, no doubt about it. Speak Up is part of the story. It's not the whole story. They had been rerouted. There was a terrorist event at their original destination. So they were rerouted to the Canary Islands, landed, sat there for most of the afternoon waiting for the green light to, again, take off to their final destination. As they're doing that, the dense fog sets in the late afternoon. Visibility really reduced to where there's not much that can be seen, several hundred feet out from the cockpit of both the KLM and the Pan Am. We also have a language barrier where we're looking at a situation with a Dutch, pilot communicating with the air traffic control tower Spaniards. And so it's broken language, it's broken accents, and it's a difficult communication scenario. But one of the things that contributes here is the dialogue that unfolds in the cockpit of the KLM flight, in the 20 to 25 seconds preceding the impact of the two planes on the runway, and where you can see in the quotes there the discussion that takes place between the flight engineer and the KLM captain, where there's a power dynamic at play there, and you can see the discussion is a really deferent one, where even as the KLM flight engineer, it has a level of, certainty that he's not received the signal from air traffic control to go ahead and take off down the runway, he's not able to communicate that in a way that gets beyond the form of a question. Is he not clear, that Pan-American flight? Is he not clear, question mark? And you can see the deference in that communication and not effective enough to stop the KLM captain from releasing the brake and charging down the runway and eventually crashing into the Pan Am that was sitting on the other side of the same runway. So it's an old event at this point, but still salient today as you think about the importance of that dialogue and the power dynamics that exist. Now, we've made a lot of progress in training these skills around speaking up. This has gained a lot of momentum and traction in organizations. But one of the things we would say as important, as critically important as this is, one of the things we would say is that it doesn't go far enough, and that it's not just about creating the skills and the space for people at the bottom to speak up. Leadership has the primary role of making that happen, for creating that space, and for eliciting the dialogue that's necessary in order to make appropriate judgments around risks. Ed Schein, if you haven't read it, has written in the last couple of years a really useful book called Humble Inquiry, where he talks about the importance of leaders going out to the workforce and doing that in a way that is an approach from a questioning perspective as opposed to a telling perspective. And that really is countercultural in so many different ways, particularly in Western culture, where we all know that it's leaders' jobs to, show up and tell everybody else what the situation is and what to do about it. But we know that that's quite damaging from a risk perspective. The book's called Humble Inquiry, great read. In meeting Ed a few years back at a safety and risk conference, one of the anecdotes that he shared as a speaker at that event I thought was really interesting. And he would talk about, as he worked with Western companies, how a starting point for working with leadership often involved just getting them out of the corporate office and out with the workforce to create a dialogue that doesn't otherwise happen. And where the starting point for that and how he would coach these executives is to coach them to walk up to an individual on the job, around the job, and if you don't possess the skill set around questioning, inquiry, humble inquiry as he calls it, a starting point can be as simple as saying, so, ... Now you don't say the ... That's the pause that you're leaving. That's the pause the executive is leaving for something to happen, to create a space. And what he observed is something pretty interesting where, when executives do this, when leaders do this, people take it upon themselves to open up and to share information, personal information, what's going on in their life, what's going on at their job, and that the dialogue that unfolds gets the individual, gets the leader a lot of information about potential safety and risk scenarios that may be unfolding in the business that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So if you're not the skilled questioner, just creating the space by starting with the so ... can be a pretty useful starting point. Now, many of you basketball fans may not think of Coach K, that's the image on the screen here, in Duke's men's basketball, as the ideal example of this perhaps. And I don't claim to know Coach K personally. I haven't coached him, haven't consulted with him. Maybe this is my pitch to do that. If you're listening, Mike, we're open, we're available for you. Maybe you don't need it. You're already doing pretty well. But, in reading a bit about his perspective and philosophy on leadership, he's a pretty interesting example, actually, of a mindset around servant leadership, humility as a leadership, and how you build that into the people around you. And there, in particular, there's a really good article in the Academy of Management Learning and Education journal that came out several years ago now, 2011. And in reading that, I was really struck by some of the examples that he shared and the importance to him, the importance that he placed on connecting with people on a personal level. And he clearly views that as something that, differentiates his leadership style. So he would talk about setting goals on a day-to-day basis. One of those was that he would converse on a personal level with 4 to 6 players on the team per day, and that the entry point for those discussions isn't about their rebounding numbers from last game. It isn't about their shooting form and the changes they need to make. It's about what's going on with your family. How are people doing? How are your courses coming? What are you learning in the classroom? It's about the personal dialogue that he would open up. And yeah, that's an entry point for discussion that probably comes back to basketball more times than not, but that's his view of how he makes himself approachable. If you want to put that into perspective in a career like Coach K's about how important he thinks that is, one of the stories he tells is about the day after the Dream Team practice in 1992, where Michael Jordan approached him after practice and asked Coach K if he'd be willing to stick around and to work on a few things with him. Now, this is before Coach K is the Coach K we know now, 25 years later, 4 national championships, etc. This is when he's still relatively new to the profession. And that was one of the most memorable moments to him, one of his biggest successes as a leader, because he viewed it as a success that he was able to make himself approachable to somebody that was working with him in a way that opened up a relationship and a dialogue. So focusing on that approachability, connecting with people on a personal level, leaders have to do a much better job figuring out how to do that. The last piece I'll mention before transitioning a bit here into some practical process is the planning piece. Now, organizations have to make a difficult decision around the amount of time, effort, and focus they will expend to planning for uncertainty, planning for probabilities, planning for things that may, in fact, never happen if we do it well, if we're lucky. This means that the organization has to get itself out of a firefighting mode if we're going to dedicate the time and the resources to being able to do this, and where, again, it's about planning for the things that will happen out on the track, out on the playing field, outside of the meeting environment that may be the launch point for that. And organizations vary quite a bit in the extent to which they engage in the level of proactive planning that's needed to keep ahead of some of these risks that may be coming. I'll leave that one fairly short because Dave will also touch on that a bit with some practical solutions. So let me transition here and talk a little bit about how, as an organization, you can work on some of these elements, a process that's needed to be able to open that up and get to work on it, and some practical solutions that we can bring in. So in the work that we do at Denison, this becomes a guiding process model that we use, and you'll notice the word performance in this slide, the first time in today's talk that you see this word, and I want to comment just briefly around why that's here and why this same process can result in both benefits to performance and risk management. The first principle that we work from is that managing risk is one of several aspects of how the organization must perform day to day to achieve its core purpose and its mission. So we don't know of many organizations in the long term, sure you can do it in the short term, but in the long term that have been successful with paying attention to one and not the other. That is profitability, performance, the financial metrics we care about, in addition to the risk mitigation that we need to keep things in balance. You've got to do them both in the long term to be effective. The second principle that we work from is that risk management interventions should be rooted in the principles and processes of change management. So in our view, this is really a form of a change management process. There's not much you can do here without at some point going out into the organization and asking somebody somewhere to change something that they're doing in their day-to-day work and in their job. So this really is about changing organizations. This is the process model that we use to guide that process with the clients that we work with. I'm going to give you the high-level walk-around of this rather than a deep dive into each of these areas, and I'll kind of break the model that we use into three phases. Not that these are necessarily linear, but all of our projects in some way or another walk through three of these higher-level phases. The first is about building awareness. Very difficult to set a priority, to launch into action, to do something new and different without much of an awareness into the organization, how it functions, and again, from a culture perspective, how the culture is shaping the way in which we're managing, responding, reacting to the risks that we have. So the front end of this process always becomes a discovery process where we do bring some diagnostic tools and methodologies into the work to surface a set of insights that the organization often doesn't have or doesn't have in a clear and aligned way at the outset of this change process. The combination of tools that we use there really can depend quite a bit on the purpose of the engagement, what may be most effective for a particular organization, but where we've got a combination of quantitative tools we've developed over time and qualitative. I'll mention just briefly in the set of things you see on that list the risk management module and the safety management module that we've created over the last 2 or so years now through the work that we've been doing both in high hazard and high risk work environments. Both of those modules are short form assessments that are intended to target some of the cultural areas that I shared earlier. So the detection, the dialogue, and the planning pieces. These are tools that help us focus in on which aspects of the culture may be supporting those things, which aspects of the culture may be a challenge when it comes to doing those things effectively, and it can get us started on the next steps of that process. Of course, there are other things like audits and getting out and talking with people. We can never avoid that to contextualize the work that we do. So step one, you've got to build that awareness and insight. Quick comment here, piggybacking on the modules that we've developed and the diagnostic perspective. One of the ways that we differentiate the work that we do in this space is that we use, and highly recommend that others use too, a process that involves 2 camera lenses on it when we're looking at risk culture and thinking about strengths and challenge areas within that. One is the distal and systemic factors that contribute to risk, and the other are some of the more proximal and focused, where again it's in a more direct way about detection, dialogue, and planning. Why do we combine both of those things? Let me give you a quick example of that. And really the story here is about what happens if you look at one without the other. And often in this space, the one that you look at is the more proximal and the more focused because it lives pretty closely connected to the outcomes that we care about managing and avoiding, like the adverse events. What happens if we look at risk planning, which Dave will talk about more in a minute, without also understanding the more systemic or underlying factors that might feed into our ability to do planning effectively? And there are some real important questions here that we need to understand from a deeper level so that we can avoid the intervention that looks more like a Band-Aid on a symptom as opposed to being able to shift and change some of the underlying dynamics. So in the case of planning, again, how much risk is inherent in the purpose and the strategy? How do people think about time horizons in the organization? Do we have a short-term, firefighting mentality? Do we have a long enough term perspective to think about long-term impacts of risk or perhaps safety in the organization? Without those pieces in place, we can introduce planning, but very difficult for that to have a sustained impact and really change the underlying dynamics in the organization. So we want to look at both as part of our diagnostic process. Awareness and insight is followed by a series of sense-making discussions, perhaps analysis that we can bring into that to make those discussions founded in evidence and data, and then honest conversation that can build alignment and priority to move to action. Surfacing 5, 10, 15 issues in the organization is a long way from getting aligned about the one or two that we want to tackle. And then I'll move pretty quickly to transition this here with the segue being really about how we move from priority to facilitating action. Because it is about what you get out of it directly connected to what you put into it, and that's how we spark the action piece of this from the insight that we facilitate, the dialogue around priority, and then what happens next when we're clear about what we want to do. And there are a range of interventions in the toolbox, everything from speak up to leader development, perhaps quality control, many, many more depending on what the main issues are. I want to transition us, though, to Dave Kirchoff so that he can introduce and talk a little bit about one of those interventions in our toolbox, the risk assessment and mitigation techniques that we've used.
Great. Thanks, Levi, and welcome, everyone. Levi has really provided a great overview of risk and the Denison approach to providing a high-level assessment of an organization's approach or readiness to handle risk within their business. In this section, we'll try to review a few key elements used in defining risks, but we'll also take a deeper dive into one particular intervention tool and risk process that has been utilized really effectively in the marketplace. We recognize that there's lots of effective tools and processes utilized by organizations today. However, we really like this tool and the process for a number of reasons, but in particular because the tool is really simple and easy to understand. It can be effective in small businesses and organizations, but also scalable to a global level. It can easily become a framework for an effective risk governance process. And we'll also talk about how the tool and process serve as effective action interventions for many aspects of the Denison model, and how it also requires a sufficient level of organizational capability in some areas of our model to be effective. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming sections. One area I'd like you to keep in mind as we walk through the presentation is how the use and embedding of these tools and the processes really helps to provide permission for employees to engage in a more open, candid conversation about risk, so that organizations can hopefully move more from a business that is risk adverse to one that doesn't fear risk, to one that openly embraces risk and views effective risk management as a competitive advantage. I decided to start this section off with a real simple question, and it's the question, does uncertainty equal risk? To help us answer this question, let's use a real simple example to bring this to life a little bit. So let's say there are two football teams playing each other. I've got a football background, so I tend to use some football examples. And we've got two teams playing each other. And I've chosen to bet on one of those teams to win. Now, if I have zero money wagered, so there's nothing at stake, no impact for me, but there's still uncertainty in who will win, am I at risk? Well, not really. Even though there is uncertainty, I have nothing at stake, so I am not at risk. Now let's change it up a bit and say that those two teams that are playing, one is the Super Bowl champion New England Patriots, but they're playing the local 9th grade Pop Warner football team. And I've placed $200 on the Patriots to win. Am I at risk to lose that $200? Well, not likely. While I have something at stake, there is relative certainty that the Patriots will win this game against a 9th grade team. I use this example to illustrate that the notion that the measure of risk really requires both uncertainty of outcome, which is really the likelihood, and some form of personal or business value at stake, which is the impact. So the tool that we referred to earlier is a real simple 3x3 matrix tool. And it's a popular tool that's used in the marketplace today. And it's real popular for assessing both the impact and likelihood of risk to organization. As you can see, the horizontal axis measures variations of certainty of an outcome and really the likelihood. And the vertical axis measures what's at stake or the impact of the risks on the organization. Now, each organization will have to determine the appropriate thresholds that make sense to their respective organizations regarding what financial levels of impact are manageable or major or critical, as well as how to segment, the appropriate likelihood percentages, less than 10%, over 50%, et cetera. Now, as you're utilizing this tool, it's also recommended that the organization aligns on some type of format or protocol that we'll look at on the next slide. So one of the things that's really important is to align on the time frame or horizon for the risk assessment. For example, will the organization look out to assess risks on an annual basis, a calendar year, a fiscal year, quarterly, monthly? The organization needs to align on that. And when articulating risks, it's really a good practice to have three elements in mind. So what is the risk? What's the cause? What's the potential cause? And what's the effect of the organization? Typically, the effect results in some type of financial impact. So I thought we'd provide a few examples to bring this to life a little bit. So example one is more of an external example. And that risk is listed as what is the risk to continuity of supply, so that's the risk, due to the financial collapse of a supplier, a potential cause, that would result in a significant business interruption leading to consequential loss of sales, which is really the effect or impact on the organization. So the second one is an example that is external and internal. What's the risk to our baby food brand and company reputation due to a glass inclusion supplier issue, which results in a recall from the marketplace? And the third one I thought would be interesting to have an internal focused example. What is the risk of a delay of our key project X due to turnover of resources on that project, resulting in failure to deliver against its financial objectives? So, as we noted in the introduction of this section, utilizing the tools and the process really provides a great opportunity to utilize the teamwork index of the Denison model to help define what the potential risks are. The input of the teams to brainstorm potential risks really is important because those teams are really often closest to the issues. The use of team input would capture a variety of different perspectives, and it creates a more inclusive environment. And the use of cross-functional participation while performing the brainstorming can be really, really effective, not only to gain greater insights and details, but also to promote a better level of collaboration and cooperation across the functions. And as we mentioned earlier, this process really provides permission to openly and candidly discuss some areas of concern, which is really important. It may be uncomfortable for people who are responsible and accountable for areas to acknowledge that risks exist in their area of responsibility. Because of this, particularly in organizations where the overall risk capability is low, you should take some care to make sure that you coach others in appropriate behaviors in this process. And it may take a little bit of practice to build some trust and encourage others to discuss risk in an open environment. So we're going to move to how you would plot on the 3x3 matrix. Now, as you note on this particular slide, I've listed this as a procurement risk assessment in Q1. And the reason I put that up there is we're going to show as we progress through the presentation how this tool can be used as an effective governance process. Now, we've selected a couple different risks. Example one is what's the risk to continuity of supply due to the financial collapse of a supplier? So we've plotted this as a likely risk with a major impact. And one of the reasons that we did this is because you utilize some input from different sources of information. So for this particular organization, they monitor financial conditions of suppliers on a regular basis. And for this particular supplier, that financial review has indicated that it's a pretty serious condition. They're having difficulties with cash flow. They're having trouble paying their bills. So they may be in some financial concerns. So the likelihood is pretty high. Now, if they did go into a financial collapse, it would have a significant or a major impact on the organization. Therefore, we've plotted it accordingly. Now, the second example, what is the risk to our baby food brand and company reputation due to a glass issue, which results in a recall? Now, if that should happen, that would be an extremely critical impact on the organization. Now, we put some processes in place to make sure that that doesn't happen, which actually reduces the likelihood of that occurring, but it is still possible, so therefore it's plotted accordingly. Now, the third risk, which is really that internal risk, is about delay of our project delivery. Now, we've plotted this in remote and manageable because we've got some steps in place where we've provided some incentives for individuals to stay on that project to make sure that we don't have the level of turnover that would impact that project. So we've plotted this accordingly. So what do you do after the detailed risk assessment is complete? The risks have been plotted on the matrix. What's next? So one example is to utilize a tool to capture the mitigation steps and put a governance process in place to ensure that the mitigation steps occur. I've provided an example here, as you can see on the screen, of a mitigation template that captures a description of the risk and a current assessment of the likelihood. We've got some accountability, who owns the risk, what the potential impact is to the organization, some context around why we assess the risk the way that we have, some controls that are currently in place, the assessment of the effectiveness of those controls, and some actions for improving that risk itself. And I'll focus on those just a little bit. You can see down in this section that's highlighted lower right that there are some action plans that are associated with this particular risk, and those are to develop some supplier failure risk mitigation plan and align that with senior leaders, launching some alternate sourcing opportunities, increasing safety stock levels, and not only of the supplies but also of the finished goods that are impacted by this particular supplier. After the mitigation steps are in place and ongoing, it's a good practice to have ongoing assessments. So another quarterly review of a risk in this particular area. This happens to be the procurement group again. And it's also good practice to note how those risks have changed based on the mitigation steps that you have taken. Now, this slide really displays or demonstrates how this tool can be used across the organization and can become a real effective governance process. So what we're trying to illustrate here is down on the lower side of the slide, this particular organization, Dave's Baby Food Company, has required that each one of the functions within this company performs a risk assessment on a regular basis. So you can see we've got procurement, manufacturing, engineering, customer sales and service, and quality, each doing a risk assessment. All of this can be rolled up into a company-wide risk profile. And in this particular company, we have a senior level team that serves as a governance committee that will review these risks to ensure that the mitigation steps are in place and are progressing according to plan, to make sure that we manage our risks effectively, that there are no surprises. This is all about proactive risk management. Now, there's a lot of benefits to this model and to this process, and we'll name a few of them here. One of the first ones is it really creates a formal process to assess and manage risks. And it does, as we mentioned earlier, utilize numerous aspects of the Denison model. The first one highlighted here is involvement. It's a great way to involve your team members, your workforce, to do some ideation, some brainstorming about assessing risks. It's a great use of organizational learning, utilizing historical issues, things that have happened within projects, things that have happened within the organization that have the potential to reoccur. So how can you utilize that information in future risk assessments to prevent them from occurring? There's a bit about capability development, involving the workforce to learn new procedures and processes for managing risks. It impacts the consistency area, development and implementation of consistent processes to manage risk within every department and appropriate projects. It fits within corporate goals of becoming a reliable and consistent organization. And also, in the center of our model, there's a little section about underlying beliefs and assumptions. And we've talked about this real briefly, but it really creates that environment that encourages the open, candid discussion of potential risks and moves an organization from one that's fearful of risk to really embracing risk and effectively managing risks appropriately.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
So with that, I'll turn it back to Emily.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave and Levi both. Thank you so very much. This time, we're going to begin the question and answer portion of our webcast. So if you have a question that you'd like to submit to us and you haven't done so already, please use the questions control panel in your GoToWebinar widget to send us a question. We've already received several great questions, actually, so we're going to dive right in here. First question can be for both Levi and Dave here, comes from Jennifer, and she wants to know, what are some examples of things you've seen organizations do to shift their culture to more effectively manage risks?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen is the use of these types of tools and processes to really proactively assess risk, to take a step back and take a look at the things that could happen within the organization and make sure that there are plans in place to really prevent those from occurring or mitigate the impact of those risks.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that quickly by talking about two dynamics that can be shifted, either with the use of a planning mitigation process like Dave introduced, or potentially even outside of a process like that. One would be the idea of teaching the language that would be needed in order to open up discussions, dialogue about risk. That's one of the really interesting things in working with individuals, working with teams, that you come to find is that sometimes you just need the language, the words, to open up that dialogue. So we've had organizations create programs called something like, Words That Work is one that we've seen. And really it gives just the starting phrases that could be used to get people into the right kind of dialogue. Certainly one of those phrases has to do with letting me check my assumptions. One of the things that's interesting here is that you do the private poll of different people in the organization, and you often find that everybody has a different sense of what the biggest risks may be, perhaps what the level of tolerance is or should be to those different risks. And there's a lot of value in just getting people's assumptions about those things out on the table. And the language, let me check my assumptions, can be something really simple that any organization can build into a useful habit and language and skill set. The second one I'll mention, again, that is part of, can be part of the planning process or result from the planning process, is assigning roles and clarifying expectations. So one of the things that we've observed in organizations is that often the response to risk, the detection of risk, is diffused across a number of different people, but not owned by any one person, any one team of people specifically. So often the response starts with everybody kind of looking around at each other to understand whose job is this and who's going to take the first step to action. So you can get a lot of leverage just out of taking some initial steps to assign some of these things to a role, a person, a team, so that we know who owns it.
Great. Thanks, Levi and Dave. We have another question that just came in here from Steve. Steve wants to know, or he says, I've been reading a lot about connecting risk to strategy in order to leverage and take advantage of that risk. Has Denison looked yet at connecting the culture model to the risk model in that way?
So there's a couple of different answers to that one, Steve. Can answer it from a research kind of perspective and a practice kind of perspective. I'll do the practice one quickly first and see what Dave might add into this. But from a practice perspective, absolutely connected every single time, and that does go back to the two lenses comment that I made in the talk. The idea that the idea that you can look at or intervene on specific elements of the risk strategy without firmly grounding those in the strategy, is really difficult, if not impossible, to do in practice. So those things are, intertwined every single time. In the work that we do with organizations, one of the ways that we address that is by trying to connect those dots early on in the awareness that we try to build, in the priority that we try to set. We wouldn't often, we wouldn't really send a client to work on an element of risk culture that didn't connect in some way with the key strategic priority. We know that the work is dead in the water every time unless it connects early on to the things that keep senior managers and executives up at night. And those often come back to the performance challenges, the business challenges, and the strategy that the organization is trying to execute. So from a practice perspective, every single time those have to be married up, and that is why we use both lenses. From a research perspective, using our tool specifically, that story is still a little bit to come. I mentioned that the risk culture tool that we've created, and the same goes for the safety side of that tool for high hazard work environments, is relatively new. So we've launched that as a full product with benchmarks available earlier this year, January 2015. We're still building the benchmarks, and we're still building the research that looks at the connections between the culture model and in particular the mission pieces of that model, which get into strategy, which get into vision and goals, and the kinds of cultural elements that I talked about today in terms of detection, dialogue, and planning. So not a 100% satisfactory response in terms of what does the research say using our stuff, but maybe that's a basis for another webinar here in the next several months when we do have some of that data, because we'll be keenly interested in that question as well.
Thinking about that question too, and looking at the mission portion of the Denison model, and particularly around the vision, there are companies that have been very explicit as to what they want to do from a vision perspective and becoming more of a reliable, dependable organization, and they're right out there in their mission statement stating that. And part of what is necessary for them to become that real stable, real consistent, real reliable organization is to minimize surprises, minimize risks. So they become more effective at managing risk as a result of them being very explicit about wanting to become that in their mission and vision statement. So hopefully that answers a little bit of your question as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. So we actually have just made it to the top of the hour here. We have time maybe for one more question. And this comes from Sandra, and maybe Dave, you can speak to this question. But as an organization is undergoing mitigation planning, can you reduce the likelihood and impact of a risk?
You can. There's a couple different ways to do that, and some of it does depend on the horizon that you're looking at. So as an example, if you're an organization that has decided that the horizon for your risk assessment period is a fiscal year, as the year progresses, the impact that those risks may have on your organization is going to diminish over that horizon. At the same time, you can put mitigation steps in place to ensure that the likelihood of those risks that occur are reduced as well. So that's just one example. But yes, you can impact both.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Dave. So before we end today's session, as we are at the top of the hour here, I'd like to extend a special thank you to our presenters today, both Levi and Dave, for a great discussion, as well as today's audience for attending and submitting some really great thought-provoking questions. We will be providing a link of today's recording of the session and the slides that were presented in an email shortly. So look for that in your inboxes. Thanks, everyone, and have a great morning, evening, afternoon.